I don't believe that children belong in psychotherapy, and I'd like to share my reasons for this. The first is that so often the problems that children are going through are coming from things going on inside of their family systems. Often from things going on in their relationships with their parents, or things that are coming from things going on in their relationship between their parents. And my basic idea is that if children are having problems as a consequence of this, then why not let the parents work out the problems? Why send the kid to therapy? So one thing I experienced when I was a therapist quite a lot is I would get calls from parents who would want to send their children to me in therapy. But what I said to the parents is, if you really believe in therapy this much, how about you come in? You can come in and meet with me, and we can see if there are things that you could be doing differently. And what I saw then, and it clued me into something, is so many parents said, oh, no, I've already fixed my problems, or this or that, or I don't really think therapy is going to help me, or I'm not the problem, my kid is the problem. And this led me to realize, well, actually, the kid is being blamed for stuff. A lot of times I think kids get stigmatized. So just the fact that they're being sent to therapy is like the parents are sending them to have some paid professional fix them. And that does stigmatize a child. That tells a child, even if it's not being said overtly, but at a subliminal level, the child picks up that they're the problem, that they have something wrong with them that needs to be fixed, and someone else needs to fix them. And when I listened to people, certainly when I listened to lots of people who told me about their stories of having been in therapy when they were kids, and having been a kid myself and having gone through a lot of this, I realized, really, it wasn't the kid's problem most of the time, almost all of the time. It's like, where did kids get their problems from? They get their problems from the outside world. And for kids, especially little kids, the outside world primarily is their family system. It's their parents who are in charge. Now you could say, yeah, especially as kids get older, they get into the bigger world, they go to school, they have friends, they're in all sorts of different places in a social environment that's beyond their parents, and they can have lots of problems coming in through that can cause them to have all sorts of things that people might say, oh, therapy could help them. And while in some cases I don't totally disagree with this, my basic argument still, for why I still think kids don't belong in therapy, is if they have a really strong, healthy, intimate, nurturing, caring, open, honest relationship with parents, and parents who are healthy, parents who themselves are doing their own healing process, kids can buffer a lot of really unpleasant stuff in the outside world. They can handle all sorts of problems. They don't end up getting bullied as much. They can have a lot more friends. They can be a lot more social. And so really, what I still think is if parents believe in therapy enough to send their children to therapy, then let the parents do it first. Let the parents get stronger, and let the parents become better parents as the result of that process, and that this will translate to their children. So their children will be able to handle and buffer a lot more of the nasty stuff that goes on in the outside world. So that's my first big reason why I think children don't belong in therapy. The second big reason is that when I was a therapist, I liked to work with people who were autonomous. I liked to work with people who were independent. I didn't like working with people who were mandated to come to therapy. People who were mandated by probation officers or parole officers or drug counselors or other different, or jobs that said they had to go to therapy. I liked people who were coming of their own free will. Now you could say, yeah, children might be coming of their own free will, but the way in which children that I've seen are really not autonomous is they are lower in the power scale in their family system, meaning they don't really have the opportunity to be themselves if it's not allowed in their system. So what I've seen is that when children are in therapy, for starters, the therapist is hobbled by being able to speak openly and honestly. Let's say the parents are really, really screwed up, but you can't always tell that to a child in therapy because it can cause more problems for them. It can create more havoc in their life. And also, if the children start to get healthier and start to grow and start to become bigger people, a lot of times that's simply not allowed in the family system. It can cause actually a lot more problems from them. The parents can really attack them. And a lot of times, whatever problems they were having in the beginning can become worse if the children become more honest, more healthy, more real, more alive, more creative. And so the problem with this is that what does happen in therapy if children are not necessarily allowed to grow freely, if they're not allowed to grow more autonomous, more independent, more free thinking as the result of the psychotherapy process? Well, what I've seen, what happens a lot is that if they're not allowed to grow more free, they have to grow in a way more twisted. They have to grow to be able to adjust to their parents more and adjust to the systems that are really screwed up that they live in. And while you might say that that's a helpful survival strategy, a lot of times what I've seen is that therapists just end up colluding with the more powerful people in the children's life. So in a way, and often it's those people who are paying the therapist. So let's say it's parents in this case. Parents who are not allowing their child to grow freely and are causing a lot of problems for the kids and causing the problems to behave in ways that are sometimes maladjusted or stunted, are paying the therapist or sending the child to the therapist or even forcing the child to go to the therapist. And then the therapist is realizing, wait a second, if I as a therapist contradict that parent or that power figure in some way that's going to cause more problems for the children, then I'll just accept the limitations of the parent. And what you end up with is therapists who aren't really honest with the children and in a way become agents of the parent, surrogates of the parent. And I think it's very, very hard as a therapist not to do this. Even very well-meaning therapists, that they end up sending the child a message subliminally, or sometimes even overtly, that the child themselves is the problem, that the bigger system isn't the problem. And so they basically tell the child, you can't be your real self. You can't really grow. And even in school, we learned about things like this. I remember once when I was in social work school, they told us, don't ever side with children against their parents. Or if you do, be very, very careful because it can be very risky. And it's like, ew, what a horrible job. Who would want to do that? Who would want a job where you can't be honest with a child about what you actually see with them? Now, again, this points out, where does a child get help? And it's a real problem. Again, for me, it came back to, well, I want to talk honestly with the parents themselves. I want to be straight with the parents and say, listen, I think a lot of your child's problems are really coming from you. And I think you come in, please talk with me about it. And a lot of times, those parents did not want that. Again, they wanted to have their child fixed. They wanted to have their child adjusted and bent and even warped by the therapist. And it's like, well, you know what? As a therapist, I didn't want to participate in that. If parents really didn't want to help themselves and didn't want to heal and grow, which a lot of parents really don't, then I don't know. I'll wait until the child is older. I really preferred to work with people once they were adults. It's hard enough that way. It's hard enough when they are adults because all that stuff is still embedded in their head. They still have to work a lot of this out. But at least they're not going to get crushed in the extreme way that children do if they become more real and honest. Now, another reason that I really thought children don't belong in therapy is I looked at the therapists who worked with children, and I usually was like really not impressed and often actually kind of disgusted. It's like, yeah, it's true that a lot of therapists in general who work with adults get off on the power of it because there is a big power differential in therapy. The therapist is in a much higher position of power. They're a lot less vulnerable, and they're a lot more in the position of knowing and being right, and the client is in the position of looking up and asking for help and being vulnerable and being open. They're much more liable to get hurt than the therapist is in the relationship. Well, if that's true with therapists and adult clients, it's even more so with therapists and children. Children are really very, very powerless. in society, yeah, they have certain degrees of power, but not much at all. They're about the lowest on the end of the totem pole of the power structure in society. And what I've seen is a lot of times the therapists who really like to work with children, they like being in that power position. It really helps them get a lot of self-esteem. And I think a lot of them even get off on it. They get off on the power. And I think it can be true with a lot of people who work with children, but it's kind of distasteful for me. And I don't know. I'm not so into sending someone who's lacking a lot of power into an environment where the person who's going to be basically in charge of that environment is going to be someone who really likes the power of it. And I think a lot of therapists who work with children, I think they almost have to like the power. They have to enjoy being in charge to be able to work in that kind of environmental system. And I just don't like it. Now, is what I'm saying the be-all and end-all? Does it speak for all situations of therapy for children? I don't think so. I think there could be some cases, surely, and I have heard of some cases where certainly children have benefited a lot from therapy, and they have found a therapist who really hears them and listens to them and cares about them and nurtures them and really fights for them and for their well-being and is on their side. I don't think it's too common. Also, though, really, that therapist who's really much better than average, who really might be a very helpful, excellent therapist to a child, really what I'm describing is a surrogate parent. So really, when I say I don't believe in therapy, for children, I don't believe that children belong in therapy, what I really am saying underneath it, what I really believe is that children deserve excellent parents. They deserve parents who really fight for them, and parents who take that role on, parents who really have healed themselves within, parents who really know how to fight for their kids, who intuitively take the side of their children and help guide and counsel their child on this really painful path through life, because it really is a very, very difficult path to grow up as a child in our world.